Hey Luke, how's it going?
It's going great. Yeah, really excited to be here. Thanks for having me on, Ren.
Yeah, thank you for joining me on Dads with Mics. I'm really excited about today's episode because it's a hot topic. You know it, I know it. A lot of people are going to know it after they watch this episode. First things first, how about you introduce yourself?
Yeah. Well, my name is Luke Adsit. I'm a peaceful parenting coach. And so what that means is that I help people to parent their kids by having empathy with them, showing them respect, reasoning with them rather than just using the fact that we're bigger and stronger than them to kind of force them to behave in the way we want to punish them. So I help parents to do things like that. And yeah, I'm a parent of two. I have one little boy who's almost 2 years old, and I have a newborn baby girl. She's just about 4 months old now. And yeah, I've just been reading all these parenting books. I've listened to probably thousands of hours of parenting podcasts and parenting, child development, child psychology. It's just something I've really began getting passionate about ever since finding out that I was going to be a parent, and even before that. And so, yeah, I love parenting. I love kids. I love the idea that I'm going to give my kids the best possible future that I can.
Wow, that's awesome. And you actually started preparing before you had kids?
Yeah, I did. Yeah, I was listening to a podcast, uh, and it was talking about something called the non-aggression principle. And so it's a philosophy podcast. And so the philosophy, he was really trying to say how does philosophy impact our day-to-day lives practically. It's not just these ideas of these you know things way out there in the universe and in the ether, but this podcast, he really wanted to make philosophy practical. And so one way is that he took this principle called the non-aggression principle, the NAP, and he said, how can we apply this to everyday life? And so one way um, that is applied is to say, I can't initiate aggression on my kids. I can't use force. I can't hit them. I can't take their stuff. I can't put them in timeout. All these things are off limits if you want to be rational. If you want to be consistent with your application of moral principles, we have to extend those moral principles to kids. And so yeah, that just made so much sense to me. And ever since I heard that, a few 4 or 5 years ago, and then also I heard about the huge impacts that parenting styles and harmful parenting styles have on kids and on their development. Like one thought that stays in the front of my mind these days is that 90% of a child's personality is set by the time they're 6 years old. So part of my
90%?
philosophy, 90%.
Wow, okay.
And so part of my philosophy is really helping parents get those first 6 years right, really helping them know what they can do and what they definitely shouldn't do in those first 6 years, so that they're not setting their children up in these cycles of harm and trauma and mistreatment, and really helping them break out of those cycles. So yeah, that's a little bit about where I'm coming from.
Okay, so you mentioned peaceful parenting, and that's the type of coaching you provide to your clients. How did that come about? Is that something that you were thinking of way ahead of time as to what kind of parent you wanted to be? Is that sort of how you were brought up by your parents? Why peaceful parenting?
That's a great question. It is something that I thought about before having kids. Actually, before I got married, when I was talking with my now wife about our values and our principles, one thing that was a deal breaker for me, is really important, is we're definitely not going to spank our kids. Are you on board with that? Right? If she was going to say no, 100%, I really think I should spank my kids, and that was going to be a deal breaker.
Wow.
Um, that
Okay.
that's how important it was for me. And so yeah, so ever since I heard on that podcast 4 or 5 years ago that about all these statistics and the data and the philosophy and the morality of parenting and of corporal punishment, That's how I got started on peaceful parenting.
You mentioned specifically spanking. Now, why was that so important to you? Was that because you lived through it yourself, or you knew someone in your immediate circle of family or friends that went through it and traumatized them, or why specifically spanking?
So yeah, that um, so first of all, one reason that I focus on that so much today, in my writing on X and on X Twitter, whatever you want to call it, is I heard a statistic once that every 50% of kids in the U.S. are spanked at least once a month, and
Once a month.
so yeah, so half of children. So this is a massive problem, and that's just the U.S. In other countries, in a lot of countries it's much higher. Um, and so it is a big problem, and there are big consequences in the world, and it's really shaping a lot of people's personality and their tendencies. And so, but yeah, personally, I was spanked pretty late. I'm finding out not everyone is spanked as much as I was, but I was spanked until I was in about fourth grade. Um, and I'm not sure exactly when that started, probably toddlerhood. And so, yeah, I was spanked with the hand, sometimes with the wooden spoon, sometimes, yeah, the mostly those two. And yeah, spanked on my butt, spanked. My hand was slapped a lot of times. I never got the shoe. I never got the belt. And it was usually it was never bare bottom. But yeah, that's how I was raised, and I do know firsthand just how frustrating it is to be on the receiving end of that. Yeah, I miss the fact that I wasn't reasoned with when I could have been. I was, in third and fourth grade, I easily could have had a conversation about, you know, oh, you did this thing. Can you please tell me why you did that thing? I could have answered that question. I could have, I was a smart kid too. I could have articulated very well exactly what I was thinking. But, my mom had four boys, and, she was I'm sure she was overwhelmed. And I'm not saying that's an excuse, but it was probably the easy way out for her. And I wish she would have put more effort in. I wish she would have done the research. I wish she would have read the books. And so I don't want other people to have to have those feelings. I don't want future adults that are now kids to have those feelings. I don't want parents of today to have damaged relationships with their kids because they're using these harmful techniques. So yeah, that's a little bit about my personal history with that.
Okay. Now, when that was done to you, was it like a last resort type of thing that your mother applied, or was it just a default, if you recall?
I mean, it was pretty often. It was probably different at different ages, but sometimes it was every day I was getting spanked. Sometimes it was maybe once a week or something.
Oh,
But it was and it wasn't just spanking. I was punished in many other ways. I was no electronics. I got one time I got no screens for a month because I did something that bad. And so it was also taking away privileges. But yes, it was a very punitive household in that sense. Not that it was like extreme or harsh, but it was definitely not. The emphasis was not on reason. It wasn't on talking things through. It was on you did something bad, so now I have to punish you, so you learn your lesson. And so that's how I was raised.
okay. Now, do you get the sense that that was like an isolated thing for you, or that was just a norm back then? That was just how discipline was handed out by the previous generation of parents.
From people that I've talked to, it's very normal. That's it's kind of the mainstream approach as far as I've heard, especially I think this is unfortunate, but especially in Christian homes. A lot of Christians believe the kind of spare the rod, spoil the child philosophy. And I know a lot of people that are even uncomfortable with spanking feel like they have to because they don't want to be disobedient to God. And I have a lot of thoughts on that subject, but clearly, just in passing, I'll say I don't think that's the proper interpretation of those verses. I don't have to get into it right now. We don't want to go there, but yeah, it was very common to spank. Uh, Basically, all my friends that I ever knew growing up, they were all spanked as far as I knew, all punished throughout their childhoods. So yeah, it was pretty normal.
Do you at least feel like nowadays it's at least on the downtrend in terms of corporal punishment, or sure, we can talk about specifically about spanking, but do you think at least that's less common than it used to be?
Yeah, so that would I don't have specific figures, but I would speculate that it is probably on the downtrend. I know that a lot of millennials are are unhappy with how they were raised, and so they're even swinging even a bit permissive, maybe too far, trying to give in to the kids probably more than they should. And but I know a lot of parents these days would rather use timeouts, for example, than spanking. That's a common thing. A lot of parents are uncomfortable spanking, but they are happy to take away privileges, to give consequences, whatever that means. So yeah, definitely a trend away from corporal punishment, but definitely I think a lot of people still use punishment in general, and perhaps they just don't know any other way. And so part of the reason that I'm out here talking about parenting is because I'm trying to show parents the way, show them the alternatives to punishment.
Okay, so is it fair to say that since you lived through it yourself, then you made it your mission to never spank or hit or punish your kids like that because you don't want your own kids to live through what you lived through? And is that why you adopted the whole peaceful parenting approach?
It wasn't such a one-to-one with that. I I didn't really have any skepticism towards spanking until I was in college, probably, until I started listening to this podcast I was talking about. And I was skeptical of peaceful parenting at first. My thought was, like a lot of Christians are, what do you mean? Like, God literally tells us, spare the rod, spoil the child. I have to do that. There's no way that's not right. And that's where I was coming from.
Mhm.
And so I was convinced more from a philosophical moral argument, with a lot of data and a lot of research, that I found that very compelling. And it was less realizing all on my own that I was unhappy with how I was raised, and therefore I'm not going to do that. Yeah, it was more from a philosophical, moral, and data perspective.
Got it. Now you mentioned you described peaceful parenting a little bit at the beginning. Can you go more into detail as to what it means in
Yeah,
terms of day-to-day life as a parent?
sure. So a peaceful parent, some things. So we're extending that non-aggression principle that I was talking about. So what that means is we're going to not be focusing on behavior, and we're not going to be punishing kids to change their behavior, but we're really going to be trying to understand what is the root cause of the behavior. We're going to look beyond just the symptomatic symptoms and behavior on the outside, and we're going to say, what's going on in this kid's mind? What are they thinking in their heart? Right. So we're not going to be using punishment, rewards, raised voices, things like that, because those are focusing, okay, you did the wrong thing, and so I have to try to motivate you to do the right thing. But the problem with that, and what peaceful parenting sees as the problem with that, is that you can't offer a solution if you don't fully understand the problem yet. So peaceful parenting puts a big emphasis on, let's figure out exactly what the child's experience is, what's going through their mind, why they're doing the things that they're doing, and then we'll take things from there. We're not just going to give a one size fits all solution. Just say whenever they misbehave, just spank them, or just use timeouts, or just take their stuff.
Right.
And so, yeah, definitely staying away from punishments and rewards and bribes and raise forces. And we're going to try as much as possible to reason with them. Or if they're not old enough to reason, if they're toddlers or something, we're just going to prevent them from ever doing things that are harmful.
Let's put it into context, though. Let's say, for example, my son, he's 6 years old. I'm making dinner. He's playing with his 4-year-old sister in the living room. And I hear a little bit of back and forth between the brother and sister of arguing. And then I hear one of them throwing a toy across the room. Yourself being a peaceful parent, what do you do?
Okay. So in this situation, you don't know who threw the toy and neither of the kids are crying or anything. Is that right?
Exactly.
Okay. Well, I might ask some questions, is anyone hurt? What's going on in here? Are you guys doing okay? If they're totally fine, I might just walk away. If nothing's broken, they didn't break a window or something, and no one's crying or in tears or upset, and I might just be okay with that.
Even
Yeah.
though, so you'd be okay with one of them, granted you don't know who, but you know that for a fact, because I mean, you heard it. It was pretty clear that something was thrown across the room in a moment of anger or frustration.
Okay, so in that case, I would expect that, if a kid was so angry he threw a toy, and I'm coming in a calm, not angry way myself, I'm just saying, hey, what's going on, guys? Is everything okay? I would think a child would probably say something like, I'm really mad, or, you know, he took my toy, or whatever the reason is for their anger.
Yeah.
I would think they would say something at that point, and I would take things from there. Um, yeah, and it really, what my approach would really depend on what they said.
Okay, so let's say his sister says the brother threw the toy across the room.
And the sister's 4 years old and the brother is 7. Is that right, or 6?
6 or 7, sure.
Okay, I'd say, hey kiddo, did you throw the toy? Is that right? And I'd have to hear what he said.
If he says yes,
I'd say, okay, what's going on? What's up, buddy?
okay, so by asking questions, then is where the approach comes in, as opposed to what you hear about most of the time, and probably what happens most of the time with a lot of parents is, hey, who threw a toy across the room? Can't do that. And then with a raised voice already and irritated voice, right?
Yeah, yeah, I would definitely be very careful how I phrase what I'm saying, the tone that I'm using. I don't want them to feel attacked. I don't
Okay.
want them to feel defensive. It's very important to me that I'm not making any assumptions about anyone doing anything wrong. For all I know, there's a really good reason they threw that toy. I mean, it might be silly to imagine, but possibly it just slipped out of someone's hand. Maybe it was completely an accident. I don't know if they did anything bad or wrong. So yeah, I would come non-judgmentally. I'd be asking questions.
Okay. Well, let's say then, for purposes of this example, that you witnessed it, that he threw the toy across the room. Now, most people would say, well, you got to deal with that. You can't just let him think that it's okay to throw things when you're angry.
Okay, yeah, if I witnessed it, that'd be a little bit different.
Yeah.
I would so if he was in a state of, such anger that he's throwing things, I would first of all, I'd try to catch him before, he's chucking toys across the room. If I could see that coming, I would go over to him, pick him up, right? As that's one of the things that I would make sure to do, if ever possible. If a child is about to hurt someone else, about to hurt himself, about to destroy something, I would, as much as possible, I'd try to prevent that from happening. If it was not possible for me, or I was not able to prevent it from happening, and he did throw it, I would go over there, I'd pick him up, I'd say, hey buddy, I'm not going to let you throw your toys right now. Okay. And
Okay.
I take him in the other room. I take him, outside or in the backyard or something. And I would, I'd say, I'm not going to let you throw toys. I'm not going to let you hurt your sister. And if he wasn't throwing a tantrum or anything, I would ask him some questions. Hey, buddy, what's going on? Are you upset? Can you tell me? Can you tell me what's up? Yeah, first priority is just making sure everyone's safe and no one's destroying anything, and then try to figure out what's going on.
Okay, understood. Uh, Now, what would you say to some people who might okay, they might listen to this and think or assume that, oh, this guy's soft. No, you're the parent. You got to go in there and lay the law down. You cannot throw a toy across the room. Go over there, take 2 minutes to think about what you did and calm down. And maybe not yell, but like raise voice just to show you mean business. What would you say to somebody like that who's saying, well, peaceful parenting sounds soft to me? What are
Yeah,
sort of
well,
maybe some of the main misconceptions about peaceful parenting?
first, if they're using timeouts, I would say if your goal as a parent is to have the kid take 2 minutes and think about what they've done, I would question whether timeouts have ever been used. Like a single timeout in all of history has ever been used for a kid to think about what they've done. Like I think in almost every circumstance, kids are not thinking about what they've done. They are saying, I am so angry. That was so unfair. I can't believe dad just did that to me. I hate him. Oh, this is unjust. I'm gonna get someone back. I'm gonna get my revenge. Wow, this was unjust. And it's just giving them an opportunity to stew in their anger, not to actually have a philosophical consideration about what they would do differently next time. And so what they don't need is to be alienated from their parent. They need connection from their parent. They need guidance, right? If when kids make mistakes, they don't need us to shame them. They don't need humiliation. They don't need pressure. What they need is someone to help show them why that's not something they should do. They need someone to help them learn how to have self-control. I mean, grown adults have a hard time with self-control. Expecting small children to have more self-control than grown adults
Yeah,
is just kind of insane. It's just not a realistic expectation. So I would as much as possible, first before jumping to an assumption, before jumping to conclusions and assuming that I know everything about what was going on and his exact motivation, I would try to figure out and ask questions and to be gentle and to guide the child through that situation. And I'd be happy to get more specific with that process. But as far as misconceptions about peaceful parenting, I think a lot of especially authoritarian parents or more disciplinarian, if you want to call it that,
sure.
parents, I think the way they view peaceful parenting is they assume that it's kind of free range parenting, permissive parenting. I think they assume if you're not punishing, then kids are getting away with stuff. They can do whatever they want. They can walk all over you, and
Right.
that's not the case at all. So that they assume peaceful parenting is permissive, but what I would say is on the spectrum from permissive to authoritarian, peaceful parenting is right in the middle. So authoritarian parenting is win-lose. It's the parent gets what they want and the child has to deal with it. Obey me or else. That's
Right.
authoritarian parenting.
Okay.
Permissive parenting would be, whatever the kid wants, I'll let him have it. I'll give in. In a sense, he is letting the kid walk all over him. Having trouble ever saying no to your kid. If the kid throws a tantrum, okay, you can have it. That would be permissive parenting. And I would not recommend that at all. That's not at all what I'm
Yeah.
preaching here. Peaceful parenting is win-win, right? So both of those were win-lose. Permissive was the child wins and the parent loses. Authoritarian is the parent wins, the child loses.
Right.
Or peaceful parenting is win-win. They both people get listened to. Both perspectives are valued. They're considered. They're listened to. They're validated. And so a peaceful parent would really care about what the kid is thinking. What is their perspective? What were the emotions they were thinking? What led up to the decision they made? What led up to the mistake? Was it really a mistake? Was there a good reason for them to do that? Was it understandable but still not acceptable? Right? We want to understand what's going on for them. And then after we feel like we completely understand what's going on for them, I'll explain very carefully in terms that the child can understand. Well, these are my concerns if you keep doing things like that. These are why I have these expectations. Okay. And I'll be very careful and I'll ask if they understand it. I might ask them to repeat it back to me so that I'm sure that they understand it, depending on what age they are. And then I would go and say, okay, so what can we do? What arrangement can we make? What deal can we make so that your concerns are addressed, right? Which often are very legitimate concerns, whether it's like they want to have enough of their parents' attention, whether they are upset that their sibling, hogs a certain toy or always treats them a certain way. That's reasonable to expect for a child. So how can we find a solution that the child's concerns are validated, that they're addressed, that they're dealt with, but also the parents' concerns about the parents' valid concerns about running an orderly household where people aren't getting hurt and things aren't getting destroyed. So both of those need to be met, and that's where peaceful parenting is. No one's getting walked all over. No one's bossing anyone around. Both people get a seat at the table and are treated with respect and listened to.
Right. So it's mostly about understanding the child and then reasoning with them to get at the bottom of the why of the action, and then correcting it in an approach that makes sure that everybody understands what's right and what's wrong.
Yes, yeah. When a child is old enough to have that conversation, that's what we would do.
Of
If a
course.
child is so young that they're a toddler, I'd have a completely different approach. Still treating them with respect and trying to figure out what they're thinking as much as possible. But because they can't reason, I might tell them why I'm concerned about it as simply as I can and kind of just make a decision and go from there. But still, if they're ever about to hurt themselves, I'll prevent them from hurting themselves as much as I possibly can. Picking
Okay.
them up, saying, "Hey, I'm not going to let you hurt yourself right now." Things like that.
Right. Of course. Because you mentioned that your eldest is 2 years old, right?
That's right.
Okay. Let me ask you this. It's the boy in this too, right?
That's right.
Okay. Does he have tantrums?
He had more tantrums back when his sister was first born, and I think that was quite a shock for him,
Yeah.
which I think is a pretty common experience. And
Yeah.
he went from all of a sudden having 100% of both of our attention, both of his parents, to now we're spending a lot of both of our attention on this newborn, right? And that was a tough transition for him. And so he did throw some tantrums there. It's been much less common these days. Occasionally he'll have a hard time going down for bed. That's I don't know if I'd really call that a tantrum, but these days it's not as common.
That was going to be my next question, actually, because what is a tantrum? Is it, I don't think that's just crying qualifies as a tantrum.
Right, right.
Yelling, maybe we're starting to get there. To me, when I think of tantrum, I think of a kid throwing himself on the floor and refusing to cooperate, and he's just like not himself. So what is a tantrum? So just so it's clear to everyone here for the context.
Yeah, I think something a common characteristic of tantrums would be that it's kind of a deliberate attempt to manipulate the parent into giving them something. So if the kid doesn't get the candy bar in the grocery store, if they say, "Oh, okay, I know how to get that. I just have to throw a tantrum," and they just start screaming and rolling around and kicking, and that would be a tantrum. That's pretty clear in my eyes.
Okay.
Um, it's different than just being frustrated. It's more of a deliberate manipulation.
Okay, so it's not an actual emotional outburst where it's a manifestation of the kid's feelings. The child is knowingly acting this way to get what they want, correct?
Yeah, and the older the kid is, the more it's deliberate. Maybe a 1.5-year-old isn't quite there on a conscious level, but maybe he's just kind of learned that works, and it's kind of semi-conscious. But yeah, in general, especially with like a 3 or 4 or 5-year-old, I would say that it's pretty deliberate.
Now, how did they get there? And at which age is the most common for kids to throw tantrums? And is it something that maybe they learn by watching other kids do, their cousins, their friends at daycare or at school? Or is it something that innately it's a manifestation that comes out naturally because it's some type of development phase in the child's life. What are your thoughts on that?
The reason a child would ever consider tantrums a possibility is because first and foremost they see their parents modeling the use of force to them. So, and what I mean by that is if parents are not listening to what their kids want, but they're kind of just saying, I don't care, do this or else. I'm going to punish you. I'm going to spank you. I'm going to put you in timeout. If parents are doing these kinds of things to their kids, um, it's teaching the kid, oh, how I get what I want is I have to use power struggles. I have to make the other person give me what I want. I have to put pressure on them until they give me what I want. And so I would say first and foremost, the primary influence is the parents. I wouldn't say it's just because they happen to see another child. I wouldn't even say that it's an inevitability. I know several peaceful parents whose children are grown now and have never once in their whole life thrown a tantrum. And I know that is kind of a shocking statement to a lot of people. Um, and to some degree, different children have different temperaments, but
Yeah.
still, that's pretty unheard of in the wider population. But yeah, I don't think it's an inevitability.
Yeah, and I have to personally agree with that because and I say this to my friends, coworkers, whoever who asks, my kids, I don't think I can say that they've ever thrown a tantrum. Am I just lucky or blessed or whatever you want to call it? To some extent, maybe. Both my wife and I are more on the calm side. We're both very emotionally mature and stable. So I think we've demonstrated that on a daily basis, and our kids see that on a daily basis. So they feed off of that. So are they, the apple doesn't fall far from the tree, right? So yes, your kids are going to turn out like you. So we're very good with emotional regulation, staying calm. It's not perfect, obviously. I don't want people to think that it's every day I'm dealing with my kids in the most calm and peaceful way. No, no, it doesn't happen. But it's not frequent that I lose my temper because I've been working on that for so many years and because of my nature of being more on the quiet side, calm side. Now, is it also an indication of how my wife and I parent our kids? 100%. I think we never thought about labeling it something, peaceful parenting or any other of the types of parenting. But I guess from your description, we would probably fall more into the peaceful parenting approach. Yeah, I could probably say with confidence that it is. So I think it definitely contributed to the fact that I can say to everyone, my kids do not have tantrums. Do they cry? Yes. Do they argue between each other, siblings? Of course. It's normal. They're brother and sister. They argue over toys. Do they yell at each other? Yes, sometimes. But do they hit each other? Do they try to manipulate us by throwing a tantrum? No. So I definitely agree that your approach as a parent and how you deal with your kids on a daily basis is going to be probably the most contributing factor in whether or not they'll have tantrums. For those of us that have been used to a more traditional parenting approach, and maybe they're looking to improve themselves and not fall into that trap of yelling and uh, throwing down discipline that maybe might be more harsh than they'd like. What are some signs that those kinds of parents that do want to switch parenting styles because they're tired of yelling, they're tired of sending their kids to their room and not dealing with it in a more reasonable approach? What are some of the signs that people should watch out for when they feel like they're about to lose it and do something they might regret later?
One of the things that I like to say in parenting is if you're parenting in the heat of the moment, you're probably not doing your best parenting in that moment. So, what I would recommend for a lot of people is in the moment, if it's possible and if no one's about to get hurt and nothing's about to be destroyed, let it go. Come back to it later. Maybe it's later that evening. maybe it's the next day, whenever, and just bring it up in a very low tension time. Maybe that time is bedtime or when you're sitting in the car or whenever it works for you, and just say, hey, lately I've noticed that, you know, you haven't been cleaning your room. Can you tell me what's up? And just listen, because maybe there is this some kind of legitimate reason. We don't know. We can't jump to assumptions. That's not fair anyways.
Right.
And so I would say, if you feel yourself angry, if you feel frustrated, and you don't know if the thing you're about to do is exactly 100% the most reasoned approach, maybe I would tend to recommend let it go. Usually, almost always, things are not emergencies. You don't need to stop this thing right now. And even if it is an emergency and someone's about to get hurt, just stop them from getting hurt. That doesn't mean you have to give them a lecture, a very stern, harsh, strict lecture, and also punishment in that moment. I'd say things can almost always wait till later.
Okay. And that's probably a very difficult thing, let's face it, for a lot of people who's, like I said, their default is to act right away. And if they're acting right away, it's probably in the heat of the moment, right? And like I said, like they're clenched fists and they can feel that they're about to like either yell or send their kids to their room right away without even talking about it first. So, what are some more specific actions when you feel yourself about to lose it? So you talked about dealing with it later, but are there maybe like some kind of like breathing techniques, or just go to another room and ask if you know for a fact you're about to lose your temper, maybe ask your wife to step in for a minute and deal with it because maybe you had a long day, so your patience is not as great as it normally is. Should you just like tell everyone to stop what they're doing, separate the siblings if that was the case of the situation going on? What are some things that they can do right away? Because they might not think about, especially in the beginning, especially if they're working on that, and it's a new approach for them. They might not think of what you just said of, okay, let me calm down. We'll just deal with it later. So, what are some more specific actions that they could take in the moment to control their own temper?
So if kids were fighting or hurting each other, of course I would always pick up whichever child and take them out of the room and say, hey, I'm not going to let you hit your sibling, right? So first of all, that's where I would start if someone's in danger, right? If that's
Yeah,
not the case, I would say, you know, is it possible for you to just step out of the room? Is it irresponsible? Are your children too young to be by themselves? If they are too young, then don't do that.
right.
Yeah, maybe it is asking your wife to step in, or whoever else is there. If you're that angry, you probably shouldn't. You should probably limit what you're saying. The things that you say are probably not going to be the best choice of words possible that you could have chosen. Yeah, I would just, as much as possible, I would just emphasize trying to not do any teaching, any correcting, any lecturing, any discipline when you're super angry. I would say it can just always wait till later. And for everyone, how you specifically do that would be different. Some people might just need to do some breathing exercises. Maybe that works for you. Maybe someone needs to just go in the other room and do some push-ups or something, or I don't know, whatever your calming mechanism, that'll be pretty personal to you.
Right.
Maybe you need to say a prayer or something. But yeah, I mean, whatever you find works for you. And as you build the habit, and as you find that you really can reason with your kids outside of the heat of the moment, those good habits will build, and you'll starve those bad habits. And it'll get easier and easier as you do it more and more, and as you see the results from doing
In the context of a tantrum, I've read some of your content online, and recently you mentioned a strategy or a tactic, I guess you could call it, of picking up your child who's having a tantrum. So holding him, taking them to another room or outside or something. And what I think sounds like distraction. asking him to add two by two, two plus two. So what are your thoughts on that? Because on one side, I'm hearing, when we're talking about peaceful parenting, I'm hearing let's address it, let's talk it out, let's understand by asking questions first, and then talking it out with our child and coming to an agreement as to what should we do to avoid the situation again in the future. But then when we talk about using tactics like this of, and I've heard another example a few weeks ago of a kid throwing a tantrum, and the parent will say, will come, go to the kitchen, grab a banana, come into the living room where the kid is, and say, "Hey, look, I found an apple." It's clearly a banana. And the child who's either crying or yelling or both, their first reaction almost all the time will be, "No, daddy, that's a banana. It's not an apple." And then the dad will like silly, like, "Oh, yeah, you're right." And then they'll have a laugh about it. And then the kid, depending on what age they are, I'm assuming, will have forgotten everything about what just happened before the banana tactic came in. So that's how they diffuse the situation. And that to me is a distraction tactic, very much like, or maybe, kind of like the example of asking him to add two plus two. So what are your thoughts on using distraction as opposed to what you mentioned earlier, which is to ask questions and try to understand what's going on?
I would definitely draw a distinction between kids who are capable of talking and reason and toddlers, right? So if we're talking a 2-year-old who has very limited reasoning abilities, I'd be much more ready to use things like counting and distractions and banana apple things,
Okay.
if a child is 6 years old and they can have reasonably complex conversations, I'd be much more hesitant to just distract them or tell them some kind of joke or something, right?
Right.
And so, something that I found really interesting that I've learned somewhat recently is that until kids are on average 3.5 years old, they have no capacity whatsoever for impulse control,
Okay.
right? And so that's actually part of the reason why if you ever tell a toddler don't do that, then they'll just go and immediately do that because all you did is, hey, let me give you a temptation, and then they have no capacity, no ability to not do that temptation, to not give in, and
Right.
to not indulge. And so that's also why distractions work so well, because they're just not able to not be distracted. And so and also when kids are in that state of tantruming, often they're kind of down in their lower, some people call it the lizard brain, where it's like the fight or flight response. They're just freaking out. If a kid is just freaking out, they're just not capable of reasoning. So what you're doing is you're taking them out of that extreme emotional state, and you're saying, hey, logic part of your brain, let's ask you a question. And so now they leave that extreme emotional state, and the logic circuits power on, and so it takes them out of that fight or flight response. And so that's part of the reason why it works so well. And so now once you kind of jolt them out of that fight or flight response, and now they can think a little bit more rationally. Now you can start to have a conversation about what was happening. Now you can start to empathize and say, you're really frustrated that I said you couldn't have that candy bar, weren't you? And I can start to explain why it wasn't a good idea to have the candy bar, or one thing that I've heard some parents do that I find a really interesting idea is, hey, you know, we can't buy that candy bar right now, but what we can do is I'm going to write it down on your wish list. And then sometime, I don't know, maybe once a week or something, I'm going to say, hey, we can buy one thing on your wish list. Here, I'll pull it out. It's right here. You said that you wanted these 5 different things throughout the last week. Which one would you like? Right. And so they get this idea that they're being validated, their thoughts and their desires are literally being written down. I'm remembering them. I'm bringing them up later. I'm proving to them that I care about what they think. And occasionally I actually do give them that thing that they want. Right. And so those are some ways those are some ways you can really help them feel heard and validated, but that still doesn't mean we have to give in the moment every single time.
Sure. Okay, and that makes a lot of sense. You mentioned earlier about punishments and bribes and that sort of thing. Are you completely against punishment, just to make things clear for the audience?
Yeah, I would never punish my child. Yeah, that's right.
Okay, and we're not just talking, obviously, you're against corporal punishments. We got that straight. You also referred to sending them to their room or a timeout or taking away a toy for a week, no TV for a week. You're against all that.
Correct.
Okay. Can you tell us a little bit more about the why we should not,
Sure.
or people should not punish their kids?
Yeah. So there's a few problems with punishments. So one, like I said a little bit earlier, whenever you punish, you're assuming you already know the problem, right? And almost always there's something about the problem that you were just wrong about or that you never thought of, right? And so it's not fair to the kid to assume the worst about what's going on, to just assume that they're bad and they were malicious. Or and another thing is punishments always assume the problem is one of motivation, and they just need to be motivated to do the right thing. So I'm going to motivate them via this external motivation. And so one problem with that is that the external motivation actually distracts them from the intrinsic motivations, from the natural consequences of their actions. So if a kid, hits his sister, for example, gives her a little smack or something, if you say, all right, you're going to timeout right now, you've now made that child focus on himself. You're focusing on, you know, I disapproved of what you did. And so now you are going to be punished. And so hopefully next time you won't want to do that. But what you could help the child focus on is, well, of course, like you can talk about why that happened and what was going on, but also you're completely distracting him from saying, from considering his sister and how did his actions affect his sister? How does his sister feel right now? By giving him a punishment, he's completely self-centered in that moment. And he's completely like, by the parent is distracting him from the effects of his actions. He is actually, the opportunity to consider whether it was a good choice is being taken away from him. He can't decide whether it was a good or bad action because he's now focusing on something else when the parent could help him focus on the effects of his actions. Oh, after you took your sister's toy, she looks sad right now. And if you say something like that, he could say, oh, I didn't even realize she was sad. Yeah, you can have it back. Like maybe he'll do that. And so yeah, punishment assumes, it's an assumption that you know the problem, and it's an assumption that you know the solution. It's missing essential important information about what's going through the child's mind, and it's distracting them from really important lessons about the natural consequences of their actions.
Okay. Now, a common counter argument against what you're saying would be from people that argue that kids need to learn that their actions have consequences. And you recently wrote some content on this on social media, on X more specifically, to the effect of punishments are useless or something like that. I'm paraphrasing. And you got a lot of let's say negative feedback on that one from people saying people like you are the reason kids these days, the new generation, are the way they are now, spoiled. What's your response to that? To people that say, you're completely wrong. You need to lay the law down. Kids need to know that there are consequences to their actions. When somebody commits a crime, they're either fined if it's just traffic violation, or they go to jail if it's a more serious crime. So people need
Right.
to know that there are consequences to their actions, and that starts with kids. What do you say to that?
Yeah. So first of all, like what I was saying is, punishment actually distracts them from the consequences of their actions, right? So that would be the first thing I would say, is that you're making it harder for them to learn that lesson. Um, And then if you're going to use the example with the government, it's actually extremely uncommon for someone to get a fine or to go to jail or something, right? Like 99.9% of people's interactions with other people are, non-punitive. We're negotiating with people, we're talking to people, we're asking them, hey, would you like this? Can we meet at this time, or does this work for you? In your relationship with your spouse, with your friends, with your boss, with your employees, with your parents, with your family, all of these situations are non-punitive as adults. And
Right.
so to set them up to be dependent on punitive reactions to what they do is actually setting them up for failure. It's not preparing them for 99.9% of interactions as adults. The other thing is the government, and we don't need to get too political here, but the government is not good at keeping people from being criminals. The recidivism rate, the rate at which people who commit crimes and go to jail, the rate at which they commit those same exact crimes and go to jail again, is like north of 90%. So even as adults, punishments don't actually help people stop committing crimes. So even when the government does it, it doesn't work.
Right.
So those are a few things I would say about using punishments.
Good point. Now, I'm thinking of an example just because, again, and I'm not trying to play devil's advocate because I do agree with a lot of what you say and your approach, obviously, as I mentioned earlier. But I'm thinking of what some people might come up as counter arguments
Sure, sure.
because there will be a lot, there will be a lot of people who will disagree with you. The more traditional people or people that just, again, think that they're parents, they're not friends of their kids. I'm not there to try to understand you. I'm your parent. Do as I say, and that's just how it is, which are common phrases that they use when dealing with their kids on a daily basis. So when they might hear this, they'll probably think to themselves, well, hold on a second. Okay, how about if my son hit his sister? Let's use that example again. Now, in the moment, I send him to his room right away. That doesn't mean that I'm not going to deal with it later. So I'm sending him to his room for, let's say, an hour. And then after a while, when he's calm and also I'm calm, then I can go up to his room and we can have a talk. So so it's not necessarily that they're not gonna deal with it. They will. It's just that in the moment, they need to know that what they're doing is wrong. So I'm sending him to his room. That's the punishment for an hour. But I will still have a conversation with him after. So is there a middle ground there? How in that specific situation, is that more acceptable by your standards?
Yeah, I would say it's not acceptable. I would say, do we believe as adults, do we believe are people innocent until proven guilty? Why would that be any different for kids? Are you going to jump to an assumption, jump to a conclusion about exactly what this kid was thinking, or knowing somehow that what they did was wrong? Maybe something happened and you didn't get the entire 100% complete picture. Maybe he was acting in self-defense. Maybe he was angry because of something else, right? And I would say you're giving that kid an hour to stew in how angry he is at you. You're giving him an hour to think of all the reasons that he is justified in hating you. And is that really what you want your kid to be thinking about for an hour? I mean, I think the relationship between parent and child is so important. I wouldn't sacrifice anything to damage that relationship. At all costs, I would protect that. And so I would, one of the things I say is, 99% of parenting is just credibility. Do your kids trust you? Can they hang on every single word that you say? And if you're making occasionally, it doesn't even have to be that often, but if occasionally you're guessing wrong and punishing kids or sending them to their room for an hour and it was completely unjust, if occasionally it's completely unjust, how is that going to affect your kid's view of you? Can they trust you no matter what if occasionally you're really wrong? So I would be very, very hesitant to ever jump to any assumptions and punish. And it just doesn't need to happen. You don't need to punish right away. And it's the idea that you can just teach your kids right from wrong. Like morality is a very difficult thing to answer for a lot of adults. Like there are lots of moral questions that are not cut and dry. And there's a lot, philosophers have been talking for thousands of years about exactly what is morality and how do we know what's right and wrong. And so to expect a child to have figured that out already is kind of crazy, and to punish him for not having figured it out and not having the self-control of a grown adult. And so, yeah, and the other thing is, when you're punishing a kid, you're making a judgment that what they did is wrong and that they deserve to be punished. And so I would question whether, like, how much of a child, like even who he is and the kinds of decisions he makes, how responsible is he for who he is. And I would
Well,
say if the parent is responsible for modeling good behavior, for modeling virtue, for vetting the friend group, for deciding what school he goes to deciding who he hangs around all day, to what TV shows he's watching, to what he's watching on YouTube, to what how much of screens he's using, to how much he's playing outside, and like all these factors, even to the point of like his genes, like you decided who your spouse was, you decided half of his genetic code and what temperament he would have in that sense. And so the extent to which you're responsible for who your child is like infinitely greater to the choices that your 6 or 7 year old has made. And so if anyone's deserving of punishment for his misbehavior, it's the parent, not the child. The child hasn't made any one of those decisions. And
right.
if you want to teach anyone morality, teach it to yourself and model it first, and then maybe your kid will pick up on it.
Yeah, it comes back to modeling the behavior, right? It's often what it comes down to at the end of the day. What you want your kids to be, you got to show yourself first. Emotional regulation, uh, having confidence, dealing with things in a calm manner, not complaining. I mean, you name it, resorting to hitting, punching a hole in the wall. If you're doing all those things, chances are your kids are going to be like you, right? If you're an unstable person, chances are your kids are going to be unstable. Now, I obviously there are exceptions, but the general trend will probably lead us to ascertain that with almost 100%.
Yeah, absolutely. Mm-hmm.
Okay. Look, let me throw one last counter argument your way just to make it more interesting.
Sure.
For people that are listening and might not be convinced. Uh, let's say a father who's listening to this will just throw at you, well, look, Luke, it all sounds really fine and dandy, and it seems like it's working for you. But you know what? At my house, that's just not who I am. I'm not this gentle, loving person who lives with my child. I'm a parent, and that's just always how I've done it. That's how my parents did it, and I turned out fine. And there goes that phrase there. I turned out fine. I was spanked. I turned out fine. My parents yelled at me every day. I turned out fine. What do you answer to that?
Yeah. So if you're saying, well, this is just who I am, you know, this is just what I do, does your child get that excuse? If that's just who you are that you punish, is it just it's just who your kid is, that he takes his sister's toys? That's just who he is. That's just what he does. If it's okay for you to say that, it should be okay for him to say that, right? And if you're sitting here justifying the mistreatment of children, I would question whether you did turn out fine. But
Yeah,
yeah, I it's it you have to be able to apply the standard that you're using for yourself to your child as well. Does he get that excuse too? And a lot of parents that would want to use that excuse would not be willing to give their child that same exact excuse.
perfect. Luke, let me know. You mentioned that you offer parenting coaching services. How can you help people, and where can they find you if they might be interested in seeking out your help?
Yeah, so if anyone would like to learn more about peaceful parenting, they want to maybe become a peaceful parent. If they're having recurring misbehavior, their kids are hitting or taking or talking back or whatever it is, maybe it's tantrums. Reach out to me, send me a DM on Twitter. I'm also actually putting together a community, a paid private community for peaceful parents. And so under any of my threads, there will be a wait list and you can join that wait list. And just to sign up to be notified when that's coming out. And so that'll be to help people know exactly how they can be peaceful parents in very practical ways. And yeah, you can join that and network and connect with other peaceful parents and learn all about that. And so yeah, and if you have any doubts at all, or if you just have any parenting questions, just send me a DM on Twitter. I'd be happy to talk with anyone there. And yeah, I'm on X or Twitter at Peaceful Tips.
At Peaceful Tips. Oh, perfect, man. Luke, thank you so much for doing this. Hopefully, you convinced at least a few people so, to become peaceful parents. And yeah, I really appreciate your time today.
Yeah, thanks so much, Rim. Thanks for having me on.